Okay, so evaluation. So my first question is, how do you describe to students what evaluation is? Because I think that some have very different ideas of what it actually is to others. Any thoughts? Because some people say it's just counterbalance, and other people will say that it's about the degree, or any sort of like weighing things up, or I was just saying evaluating is the definition of evaluating. So you say weighing. Does anyone else have any other different?
Well, I think it depends on the question, I guess, and what you're trying to do. That if it's a question that's obviously got a sort of what is the most effective way, or whatever, it is that weighing up, it is the coming to a judgment. But in some other contexts, it can easily be, just a sort of critique of an argument, or it doesn't always work in this case, a little bit a caveat, essentially. There's a good word.
Caveat, I like that. Nicola?
I'm really reluctant. I know you can get marks for it, but I really don't like it when counterbalance. Because I think it's really, really easy to not actually evaluate. I think it's still analysis. Quite old school in kind of my marking on that, really. But I do find it's the skill that the students struggle with the most. Even when we've tried to use like the tutor to you things and the structures to help you conclude. So literally now we just do what does it depend upon, and we try and build something from that. If I said to some of my students it's a caveat, they'd look at me like I'd spoken in Latin. I'd like to hear other people's views on what they think about the counterbalancing, because I'm so anti it as evaluation.
I agree that it's very difficult, because sometimes it works, sometimes getting a counterbalance is evaluating, but it isn't always the case. And someone said actually that there's different interpretations across different examples. So AQA prioritizing the weight of the point, whereas Excel just seems to be more about providing analysis on the counter side. And actually, even in some of their, you're right, because even in some of their like their kind of literature, it says giving a counterbalance. So
which to sort of reinforce Nicola's point, that annoys me in some cases, because it sort of says that nothing is evaluation, because you put argument A first and argument B afterwards, and B becomes the evaluation, and reverse it, and A is the evaluation. So
well, I mean, it's just it then becomes also do you count it as analysis or evaluation, and therefore does if can it be that you can fiddle the marks around so that you've got more analysis marks and fewer evaluation marks, if that's what you need, and work it out that way? That then becomes very, very difficult. So I think looking at the extent and weighing up the arguments, but also there's a big difference between AQA and Edexcel on how often on the sort of questions that you need it for. So you need evaluation in Edexcel sense in quite a lot of the questions, whereas it's perhaps a little bit more on the bigger questions on AQA, which is another whole thing. Go on, Jake.
I forgot what I was going to say, partly. So am I right that I've switched from B to A, as well just said. In the B description, it was saying stuff like weighting the significance of competing arguments. Are those words still in A?
Yes, but they seem to award marks, that they don't necessarily award marks in that same sense. So okay. Those words are there, but also the words, I think I've actually got it in front of me. Recognizing different viewpoints, for example, is classed as evaluation. They'll get marks for it. So I realise there is a bit of nuance there.
In the wording, in B, it was in the wording of every single final point, and then I was just always trying to do what my history A-level teacher always did with us, of telling us to set up a straw man and then knock it down by pointing out the flaws, and then that felt like a good. With evaluate the effectiveness of a sugar tax, I get them to say, well, the effectiveness of the sugar tax will depend on the PD. You can talk about reasons the PD could be high or reasons it could be low, and then so PD is going to be it's going to be low, isn't it? So then they list one reason it's high and then say why that's a load of nonsense. So it's the bit of saying that there's a slight significant argument, but not really because.
I mean, that's what I tend to do, but I don't know if that's right. Nicola, you've got your hand.
I think that elasticities, discussing the elasticities is one of the best ways to get evaluation on any kind of, well, any pretty micro topic, isn't it really? And it's one of the tricks I'm trying to get my students to use, to try and say, talk about size, talk about significance, think about your efficiencies, think about your elasticities. But it is so difficult to get them to think about those elasticities, which is why these together are so useful in this chat.
I agree with that, and I think something that you've just kind of sparked to me that makes me think about this is that evaluation is difficult because what is needed to evaluate is different each time. So sometimes it will be about the elasticity, sometimes it'll be about the size, sometimes about the significance, and when we're writing, if you ever write a model answer, we almost intuitively know which avenue to go down, but there are so many avenues that they can go down that it becomes very difficult to kind of, I don't know where, I can't work out whether it's good to give them a few things to focus on that they can kind of fall back on, particularly at the lower end, or whether by giving them a few things, you're then shutting off all those other avenues. Just looking at the comments, signposting is useful, particularly actually in Excel when it's not always clear exactly what is evaluation, what is and what is analysis. I should point out I'm not an examiner, so it might be that it is very clear and I'm just not understanding it. So evaluation is very different for the effects type of questions than the causes type of questions, and actually in the policies type of questions as well. But I agree that it is harder for those causes questions. Making the elasticity analysis relevant, make the relevant elasticity analysis completely compulsory rather than for extra marks, so that it's just done every time as every answer. Am I interpreting that right?
Yeah, sorry, I'm terrible for. I'll lose a thought, so I have to write it down. So yeah, he would do like points test where if you got like less than 80%, you wouldn't pass it, and I can see he would say the effectiveness of this tax depends on the determinants of this type of elasticity are, and you'd have to get all of those things, and then I suppose you could take it one level further and say it is essential that for any good I name to you, you can tell me the likely elasticity and tell me why for each determinant. And if we got to a point where we were sure that no matter what good I name, they can go through SPLAT or whatever the acronym you use for all the determinants and tell me which one it's likely to be and why.
I mean, that's very, very good for having some certainty. Which is helpful, as they, particularly at the students at the lower end, to have something to cling to, and something that's almost automatic is really helpful. It does completely depend on the nature of the question. How large is the black market? All of these things are quite niche to individual questions, and a lot of the time it's about knowing about the market and about knowing about the world. So if you don't have the contextual knowledge, it's like significantly harder. Andrew?
Well, I was going to actually say something similar there. That I think it's very much linked with application. I think good evaluation. Sometimes I describe it, to take this elasticity idea. Sometimes I describe it to students as you get a sort of almost like level 1 of making that point, and somebody says it depends upon the elasticity of demand. Stops, and you go, well, okay, yeah, well done, thanks. Then somebody else might go to the next level and say, because if it's elastic, then this thing will happen. If it's inelastic, then it won't, and the policy will fail or whatever. Okay. And then the third level is to say, well, and in this particular market, in this context, in this macro condition, whatever, I think it's going to be this, and therefore the policy works or whatever. And so you can make the same point be stretched out into deeper and deeper sort of levels of evaluation. It's all context. Yeah.
I also like that is quite a formulaic way of doing it, and I mean I really struggle with the kind of formulaic stuff, because on one hand it's such a good crutch and such a good way to get kids started. However, it's at what point does scaffolding become kind of caging? So I really struggle to find that balance, but in lots of ways I really like that is very, you can almost follow the same process lots of times and kind of get used to it. Or maybe it's just a case of like, when you make a recipe, the more you make the recipe, then you start to kind of, the more comfortable you are with making the recipe, the more you can kind of riff off it a little bit. How much are we encouraging pupils to shoehorn assumptions like rational agents into such an essay? Again, I think it depends on the question. I mean, if you just shoehorn rational agents into a bog standard question, I think it's pretty low. I think you do get some credit, but just pretty low. I don't know any other people, but it might, depending on the question. If the question's about, I don't know, energy markets, then actually the fact that we're irrational in those markets is really, really important. Any other answers to that question? How much you rely on assumptions as a pathway to evaluation? Anybody?
I use it a wee bit. So I've just started this year, the first time I've been teaching the AQA A-level as opposed to Edexcel. And in AQA, obviously, there's a bigger part of it involved with behavioural economics, much more so than there is in Edexcel. And I think actually it's a really useful way to evaluate, particularly in micro. So when we talk about various government interventions, most of them involve the price mechanism, be it a tax, a subsidy, a pollution permits. I actually think it's a really nice rational thing. Well, actually, does a higher price always lead to, say, lower demand? How much do things like herd mentality and social norms and bounded self-control, how much actually do these really matter? I think it's just a really nice nuanced way to do a bit of an evaluation. And I think it's really nice. It's the sort of thing you can say within 2 or 3 sentences. So in a really tight exam time, in terms of like marks per minutes, I think it's quite an efficient way to gain extra evaluation marks.
And how well do you find that your students can write that in a way that isn't very generic, that brings it back into the question? We're talking about evaluation and how we manage evaluation, Javed. But I know that when I've kind of gone down that avenue before, it becomes a very stock answer, and it depends on, and it might not be true because people aren't rational. How do you get students to really apply that to whatever question is asked? How do you kind of get them to?
Yeah, I think I suppose it depends obviously on the question, but I think that particularly when it comes to like market failure interventions, I think quite a lot of them refer to like addictive substances, be it alcohol, minimum pricing in Scotland, which obviously I'll mention, or we look at tobacco or gambling, or they tend to be kind of syntax quite often based questions. And I think for them, then using examples like bounded self-control become very relevant. You make them quite particular to people's struggles to manage their own self-control and their own restraint. I think for those kind of questions, it can then become quite easy. Or even for positive externalities. So, I mean, for example, I think when we talk, for example, about things like in Australia where they tried to have an opt-out system for things for certain donations, or when they tried to give a cash reward for blood donations, the fact that actually the quantity of people who would donate went down. I think the idea would be, well, actually, it went from being a very altruistic thing to do to just being quite a grubby financial transaction. So I think when we try and use those kind of examples, it becomes much easier to apply, particularly to externalities.
Yeah, and so I think in that case, that's kind of what we said. It kind of builds on what we said, that it depends so much on the context, but also knowing those contextual examples and kind of having that knowledge to draw on. How do we help? I realize this is kind of moving into contextual stuff, but specifically within context, in order to evaluate, how do you get students to understand the context in order to evaluate, rather than just so they've got additional application? Because just using an example is just the knowledge mark, but how, what are the strategies, what are the sorts of things that then become very useful to evaluate? Go on, Jake, explain that. You're muted.
I was kind of being pessimistic. I was kind of being pessimistic and just saying, mate, is there a degree to which you can, or is that the kind of stuff of just, they know it or they don't? It's difficult, and that's kind of why I'm asking, because I'm wondering if there are any sort of broad nets, if you see what I mean, that any kind of areas that cover a lot of
ground that you can draw into a lot of things. I like using like some of the visual capitalist infographics as a starter, because, you know, over time you actually build up quite a lot of it you can apply to a lot of different things, and lots of different bits like that. Incentive clash effects where cash, okay, sorry, just explaining the one above, aren't you? Okay, so and then go on.
Well, are you saying like associate? I suppose what you're asking is, could you know, put up words on a thing and they have to come up with as many associations that are linked to it as possible, or something like that? Do you mean that kind of thing?
No, I didn't actually, but that's a good shout. I meant deliberately exposing students to kind of things, ideas, data that can often disrupt things, that run contrary to a lot of our kind of policies. So, you know, things like just like the disrupting trends in technology, or a lot of these sort of behavioral examples. But you're right in that, you know, you can only cover so much of that, and you can't cover absolutely everything, and they do need to know their own thing. You know, they need to have decent knowledge on lots and lots of issues. It's not like the examples say you're going to be examined in cigarettes and this and that and the other, but there are a few trends that we can kind of leech onto, because they do tend to fit into lots of categories. Are there any other techniques that we use for evaluation, not necessarily in an exam, but just sort of to build students' evaluation skills? Oh, go on, Sarah, sorry. Happy to share screen to show how I teach evaluation in macro. Yeah, that'd be great. I'm not sure if you can. Hang on, let me just let you. Just participations can share screen. There we go. I've clicked a button. You should be able to do that now, Sarah.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, right. So you're going to get screen share by one computer and hopefully voice by the other. So
okay.
We'll just see if this works. I'm used to teaching on Google rather than on here, so it's a bit different, but I think this will hopefully work.
So good.
Okay. Oh, I just can't see what I'm actually sharing. Okay, hopefully you can see some paragraphs.
Yeah, we can see
colourful paragraphs there you go. Okay, so I particularly in macro to start with, and I think it's easier to start it in macro and then I kind of move it into micro afterwards, but I tend to get students to first of all write a kind of basic counterpoint, then explain it, then consider what that depends on. Oh, I've just moved that, and then kind of call it in the context. So this was kind of a classic kind of policy essays sort of idea, so macroeconomic policies, and then just some suggested ideas. So they kind of, I think, can get ahead of themselves too much in a paragraph by going too quickly into the depends on point, whereas they can actually write more if they start with that process. So yes, you can see it says, however, the increases in disposable income may not lead to increases in consumption as consumers may decide to save. So rather than kind of rushing into it, depending on something like marginal propensity, you're sort of building up gradually. So you've got the basic counterpoint, then you explain that people might save, what that would lead to, then consider the kind of depends on, so some ifs, like if this happens, if that happens, and then try and call it in the actual context. So at this particular time, so this essay was based about 2009 and the kind of post-financial crisis situation. So at that particular time, unemployment was obviously rising, confidence is quite low. So that's the process that I try to use to get students to kind of do that. So state the point, and then if I show you just another example, which people probably are familiar with, can you see that as well? No,
it's not the same one.
We're on cutting rates. Is that the one you're talking about? Or?
So, right, hang on. Can't share as easily. Right, I just got to switch out and switch back in and just share that one. So the kind of classic evaluation in balance of payments is typically like the Marshall Learner thing. And again, I find students are really kind of keen to rush into telling me they know about the Marshall Learner condition and, the effects of, maybe this is for depreciation of the pound essay, so the effects depending on Marshall Learner, but actually just building up the fact of the inelastic point first. So getting them to consider that import prices changing might not have the effects if import demand is inelastic to begin with, with a diagram, and then considering actually it depends on whether that Marshall learning condition is met, and well, would that be met in the UK? So that process runs through quite a lot of my evaluation. So state the point, explain it, then think about what it depends on, then bring it back to the data, bring it back to the context, and they're able then to write quite chunky evaluative paragraph with that.
And again, that's similar to kind of, in some ways, it's similar to what Andrew is saying, that sometimes it's nice to, well, that I was saying about Andrew's point, that it's nice to have the sort of it's nice to have a process to almost lean on, at least until they are confident in that kind of thing. I think as well, just with at the end, when they're putting in context, it's the saying it in context and then bringing it back to the point as well, because often they might say, oh, in this case, demand for imports is inelastic, and then leave it there, and it's getting them to just do that final bit, like you're so close, just bring it, and therefore the answer to the whole question is moot.
Yeah, bring it back to the question, absolutely.
But Marshall learning conditions are a really kind of dangerous one for them, just throwing it in, like kind of dropping the bomb and then running. Like they just say, oh, but it depends on the Marshall learning condition, and then they're running in the opposite direction. You're like, what was the point of what have you given to us there? And that was really helpful. Something else I quite like in evaluation is not necessarily an exam technique, but building it up, but helping students to build it up, is if they've got like if we're discussing something and there's a number of arguments, I'd say, you've got 10 coins and you can allocate them all evenly, you can give more to one and less to the other, which arguments are stronger, and having that just discussion sometimes in pairs, being like, well, I think this is a good argument because this, so I'm going to give this one 3 coins and I'm going to give this one 2 coins, and just being able to talk through it, because as I've said lots of times, talking is the kind of precursor, is the step between thinking and writing, that sometimes just helping them to build those skills and actually have those conversations. Whereas sometimes in evaluation, they don't necessarily know what conversation to have. So it kind of guides them a little bit more. Go on, Andrew.
Oh, you could tell I was there.
You breathed in.
Yeah, no, exactly what you're saying. That goes back to the idea about not being too formulaic. And I suppose what I suppose students don't have, I think, often is a sense of rhetoric in a more general sense about, how are you going to compose this particular argument and say this particular thing, and therefore, what order do you want to put your different ideas in? It's not a neutral thing to just shift your ideas around, and the emphasis is given by when you come up with things and how you defeat some straw men, as Jake said, and stuff. So I think that's all really important, and it's difficult and hard, but it's all about tacit knowledge and experience, really. I remember one question a few years ago that was about what to do about a lack of competitiveness or something, and we sort of decided in the class that the ideal answer went through all the sort of usual, you could fiddle with the exchange rate, you could put some tariffs on, you could whatever, and then eventually you dismiss all those and go, well, in the long run though, it's productivity, isn't it? And putting it in that way round and knowing where you were going for your conclusion and what your final conclusion was going to be is actually evaluation in that sense as well.
Absolutely, because it's the final judgment thing as well, isn't it? It's kind of getting them to stick. So as either any techniques for in the classroom building their skills, or from getting them to put their skills on paper, is there anything else that people use or find helpful?
I think you've got to scaffold it as well. So, I would start with year 12, really basic. So I do just start with a counterpoint. So can you argue the case? Can you give me an alternative? And then gradually we're kind of building up to, can you consider what that depends on? Would that definitely happen? Picking apart the chain. So, by the end of the first year, everybody can hopefully give a counterpoint, and then we can start weighing. But I don't even attempt anything in terms of causes evaluation until year 13, because they just don't understand evaluation well enough, and it seems to scare them. I kind of then approached like a causes question, like why has the exchange rate changed, for example, and then starting to weigh up the relevant factors, or what's the most important or significant, and even bringing in the idea that the evaluation can actually be agreeing in saying, yes, that's a weighty point, that's the most important point, rather than countering it, which I think they find much more difficult to understand than just the basic sort of counterpoint thing. So yeah, I'm sort of deliberately adding a little bit as we go all throughout the course.
Building on. With the causes one, I saw quite a good thing on a history, someone on Twitter with history, and they were kind of using they're using like a strawometer, so the kind of the long-term causes, the short-term causes, and then the straw that breaks the camel's back almost. And in some cases, that's quite a nice way of thinking about it for things that have rumbled on for a long time. But equally, in other cases, it's a huge question, and kind of getting down to those bits requires a knowledge of history, a nice knowledge of, the catalyst and all of that stuff. And it starts becoming much less theoretical and much more as a kind of almost historical to some extent. The other thing that I find useful is if you are kind of giving point, if you're not necessarily when you're applying an essay, but if you're just discussing something and you have kind of a point and a counterbalance, a point and a counterbalance, a point and a counterbalance, is then saying, okay, on which line, which one of these wins and why, and then writing that in a sentence why that one wins. So it might be, I think we're doing one on like leaving the EU, and it's being able to recognize that both might be true at the same time, but one is more important than the other. So it might be, despite us no longer having to pay whatever fees or whatever, so the government therefore might benefit, however the economy as a whole might not. And so kind of thinking of being able to write that in a single line that acknowledges both sides, but still kind of decides which one is more important. That can give you kind of a few really, really good lines that you can then feed off. I find that useful quite like lower down when you're trying to get them to really give their answer and give their opinion. I'll go Nicola, then I'll go Andrew, and then we'll move on to the next one. Go on.
Sorry, I'm just really quickly, just in response to the last point, because I used to teach like that, where I would scaffold really slowly and build up to evaluation. And then what I found in year 13, my students were going, well, this answer was good enough 6 months ago and now it's not. And I was almost fighting against, I'd almost built in bad habits. So I'm really interested to find how other people counteract that, because now I teach, if I put evaluation even into my teaching, so I will literally be going, therefore, it depends upon, to try and just get that in. So I'd be really interested in, I can't remember the last person who spoke, I'm sorry, how they get over that last bit of, okay, because mine just almost got into bad habits of, right, I've done a counterpoint now and I can move on to the next question, which is tempting, isn't it? Because there's too many marks for the time we've got.
It really is interesting, isn't it, how a lot of the conversations we seem to be, this is a really good idea, but there's a big problem. This is a really good idea, but there's a big problem. And it's finding the place in between that actually it helps with some places and not the other. We seem to be coming to the same conclusion a lot of times. Andrew, what was your... The
only other thing I'd say as a tip or something, it goes to Nicola's point a bit, I think. I mentioned it before, is especially in year 13, get them to write a conclusion or at least tell me about it. So here's a question, it's a big essay, what's your final paragraph? And basically trick them into doing the whole essay essentially in their head. But then you can go backwards and interrogate, why is that your conclusion? Why have you come to that? Why have you dismissed that argument? So it sort of gets them to think about those things backwards. So yeah.
I think. Sorry. Just an answer to I think the question asked previously as well, with regards to scaffolding, is I'm okay with saying to students at the beginning, well, bear in mind what I've taught you so far now. With what you know now, that's a top grade version of what you could do from what I'm expecting at the moment, and then later on down the line saying, well, I expect more now. I expect that you've made progress, so you wouldn't, if you think about something else like a sport or something, you would, to achieve a lower level, you'd be like, oh, no, it's an excellent performance for a level 1 gymnast, but you wouldn't expect the same. So I think I'm okay with saying to students that over time we expect them to get better and we expect more, and therefore it's going to take more and increasingly more and more and more demand to get that A. So I would give A's for the first essay, on the basis of, if you've done the best possible job you could have done, bearing in mind what we've done so far, and then it's just kind of maintaining that standard.
I wonder if there would be benefit in initially having essays out of a lower mark than they would be. So it might be a 25 mark question, but you're only going to give them a mark out of 15 because they've only learned how to do stuff up to 15. But yeah, I don't know if that's an option, but